The Wrigley family legacy began with the birth of William Mills Wrigley Jr. on September 30th, 1861, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Today, the name Wrigley is globally synonymous with chewing gum, vast business holdings, and the iconic Chicago Cubs baseball team. But before they became the face of a billion-dollar confectionery empire, before their name adorned one of America's most famous sports stadiums, they were a modest family of soap makers navigating the uncertainties of post-Civil War America. Tracing the arc from their immigrant roots through early business experiments and shrewd marketing innovation to high-stakes acquisitions and the transformation of the Chicago Cubs into a cultural institution, the Wrigley's story is defined by calculated risk, intergenerational succession, philanthropic pursuits, and at times, bitter internal disputes. Their rise encapsulates the contradictions of American capitalism, entrepreneurial vision, corporate dominance, and enduring public fascination. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know that this story is being watched from all around the globe. William Mills Wrigley Jr. was born in Philadelphia in 1861, at a time when the city's diverse manufacturing base was responding to the new circumstances of the post-Civil War United States. William was the son of William Wrigley Sr., who operated a modest soap-making enterprise that reflected both the opportunities and limitations available to small manufacturers in late 19th century Pennsylvania. The family's means were limited, with financial fluctuations typical of the era, and the uncertainties of the broader economy pressing regularly upon households in Philadelphia's working-class neighborhoods. Early household records confirm that the Wrigleys were not insulated from the volatility that attended many northern urban families in this period, as the end of Reconstruction failed to deliver consistent prosperity to the industrial Northeast. By 1874, at the age of 13, William Jr. left formal schooling to participate full-time in the family business. This transition was neither unusual for the era nor unrecorded in family correspondence, as economic pressures often necessitated contributions from adolescent children. Wrigley's initial tasks involved direct participation in distribution, assisting with the delivery of the Wrigley soap product to retailers and individual customers across the city's grid of neighborhoods. Census records from the decade indicate that the soap-making sector in Philadelphia remained crowded, requiring persistent adaptation in salesmanship and market approach. Documentary accounts from later years point to this formative period as one in which William absorbed essential practices: route management, customer negotiation, Domination, and the vital importance of repeat business. The economic climate of Philadelphia in the last quarter of the 19th century demanded flexibility from local manufacturers and distributors. Price instability and the expansion of competing consumer goods multiplied the complexity of retail transactions, drawing families like the Wrigleys into an ongoing process of adjustment and negotiation. Trade directories from the 1870s confirm that the number of competing soap producers increased, spurred by modest capital requirements and the city's expanding transportation links. This environment foregrounded the necessity of constant innovation in product presentation and relationship building, a lesson not lost on the younger Wrigley. By the late 1870s, William's involvement in sales and distribution had shifted from peripheral tasks to regular, trusted responsibility. Family business accounts detail his growing autonomy in handling order fulfillment and customer outreach, as well as his participation in experiments with new sales incentives. The practice of supplementing products with small premiums became a regular method for encouraging trial purchases and building customer loyalty, foreshadowing strategies he would employ in later decades. Throughout these years, the younger Wrigley contributed to a household ethos shaped as much by necessity as by deliberate ambition. The intersection of economic risk with the family's incremental business gains produced a mindset oriented towards expansion and improvement. The prospect of seeking more favorable markets, particularly in regions undergoing more rapid population growth, emerged as an identifiable consideration by the early 1880s, as compiled in both family letters and business memoranda from the period. These developments established a pattern. The experience gained in Philadelphia's crowded and contested economic environment set the terms by which William Wrigley Jr. would evaluate future opportunities, and shaped the entrepreneurial routines he would carry westward. The lessons of these early decades anchored a strategy grounded in persistence, adaptation, and a willingness to relocate in search of improved prospects. In the spring of 1891, William Wrigley Jr. arrived in Chicago with $32, several cases of Wrigley's scouring soap, and a clear intention to secure his future in an increasingly complex commercial landscape. Chicago's position at the intersection of railroad expansion and Midwest industrialization made it a locus for new product innovation and mass-market consumer goods. But the environment was neither forgiving nor static. The market for basic household goods such as soap was already dominated by several larger, entrenched manufacturers, including the Procter & Gamble Company and Colgate. Wrigley's early attempts to gain shelf space and sustain sales were met with persistent barriers, not only from established competitors, but from the distribution systems themselves, which often prioritized products with proven sales histories and higher marketing budgets. This competitive disadvantage necessitated a re-evaluation of his initial plan soon after his arrival. To incentivize customers and trade partners, Wrigley began offering baking powder as a premium with each purchase of his soap. The decision was driven by practical observation, rather than prior precedent in the industry at the time. Most retail grocers noted a marked uptick in requests for the soap, not for its cleaning qualities, but for the free baking powder included with the purchase. Receipts and merchant records from several Chicago stores in late 1891 and early 1892 document a clear correlation. Sales of Wrigley's soap increased most markedly during periods when these premiums were introduced or renewed. Wrigley tracked these fluctuations with attention to both unit counts and reorder frequency, using handwritten ledgers that later became a point of reference for the firm's evolving sales tactics. By early 1892, Wrigley recognized that the allure of the baking powder exceeded that of his primary product. Consumer letters, as preserved in company archives, frequently reference the baking powder rather than the soap, expressing dissatisfaction if premiums ran out. The consistently higher engagement tied to the premium incentive altered Wrigley's understanding not just of individual product appeal, but of the underlying mechanisms driving repeat business in competitive retail environments. At this point, Wrigley expanded the offering, ordering increased quantities of baking powder from a local supplier and altering packaging to highlight the premium on display shelves. In mid-1892, the company adjusted its inventory allocations, designating more resources to supporting and promoting the premium offer. This change required a shift in logistics and a reassessment of the company's relationships with wholesale distributors, who reported greater volumes ordered when premium products accompanied the soap shipments. Direct correspondence between Wrigley and Chicago-based grocers in summer 1892 documents explicit requests to restock primarily on the basis of the incentive attached, not the base utility of the product itself. The premium model, initially conceived as an auxiliary sales device, became a central facet of the business's operational blueprint. By the close of 1892, Wrigley had begun trialing additional premiums beyond baking powder, including small kitchen utensils and promotional booklets, each tracked for sales impact. The data collected across separate retail districts demonstrated that each new incentive reliably produced measurable, if temporary, spikes in sales volumes. This iterative, empirical approach to consumer engagement established a pattern. Wrigley and his staff would document the effect of each innovation, incorporate those findings into tactical planning, and modify subsequent offers based on direct market feedback. The process was not a single transformation, but a sustained adaptation based on carefully recorded outcomes. The outcomes of this period set the foundation for all subsequent evolution in the company's product philosophy. The iterative method of monitoring customer behavior, documenting operational results, and adjusting product strategy accordingly became a defining characteristic of Wrigley's business model. These developments did not resolve the company's competitive disadvantages entirely, but they forced an ongoing reassessment of the relationship between product, incentive, and consumer demand. The insights gained during these critical early years in Chicago would inform the company's transition into new lines of products and new approaches to market competition throughout the following decades. The reorientation of William Wrigley Jr.'s business activities away from soap manufacture occurred in the late 1890s, following a decisive evaluation of market signals. Initially, Wrigley's Chicago-based enterprise had aimed to secure a foothold in the household goods sector, distributing scouring soap under the Wrigley name. Sales efforts during this period leaned on premiums, small incentives bundled with product purchases, to stimulate demand and offset the competitive pressures endemic to the industry. Baking powder, inexpensive to produce and sought after by grocers, was employed as Wrigley's primary premium, paired with cases of soap in a bid to secure recurring orders from retailers. By late 1898, sales reports and distributor correspondence corroborated that the baking powder incentive was not only successful, but in some instances, eclipsed demand for the soap itself. Grocery buyers increasingly favored the premium, submitting reorders for the bundled baking powder rather than for the soap alone. Recognizing the potential, Wrigley responded by modifying his distribution arrangements and shifting primary production capacity. Internal company documentation from 1899 notes a formal redirection of resources. Manufacturing efforts were concentrated on baking powder, with soap becoming a subsidiary concern. This strategic pivot was not initially driven by visionary optimism, but by empirical observation. Routine sales reviews and written feedback from Wrigley's retail partners recorded that consumer preference for the baking powder bundles had become apparent and sustained. In response to these findings, Wrigley deployed additional premiums to further isolate purchase drivers. Among the most notable of these follow-on premiums was chewing gum. Unremarkable at the time but widely available from multiple confectioners, Wrigley procured quantities of gum as a trial incentive, pairing it with baking powder shipments to key retail accounts. Over the course of several procurement cycles in 1900, itemized sales ledgers and purchase orders provided objective evidence of a recurring pattern. Accounts that had previously reordered solely for the baking powder were now placing additional orders on the basis of the included chewing gum. Sales staff, noting the trend in routine communications, increased allocations of gum to supplement their efforts. By mid-1901, analysis of cumulative sales data led to formal reconsideration of the product hierarchy within Wrigley's portfolio. Whereas soap had lost traction and baking powder remained viable, the gum premium displayed growth potential independent of its role as a mere promotional item. Senior sales managers annotated regional reports with recommendations to expand gum distribution. A gradual rebalancing of production and inventory followed, facilitated by cross-departmental directives emphasizing ongoing data collection and review. The organization's approach to product transitions during this period was defined by sequential adjustment, deliberate measurement, and willingness to redeploy assets to new categories as evidence warranted. This procedural adaptation established the core operating principles of the early Wrigley Company. The tracking of consumer preferences, rigorous testing of premiums, and rapid adjustment to sales trends became ingrained in daily practice. Through these actions, empirical review and responsiveness were not theoretical ideals, but operational necessities. The trajectory from household soap to baking powder and from baking powder to gum thus followed an incremental, data-driven progression. The completion of this phase set a template for future strategies and positioned the company for its subsequent concentration on chewing gum as its primary product line. In the spring of 1893, William Wrigley Jr. initiated a critical phase in the evolution of his business by introducing Wrigley's Spearmint and Juicy Fruit, two proprietary chewing gum brands that marked the company's first foray into brand ownership rather than mere distribution. The launch was timed to coincide with intensifying competition within the growing Chicago confectionery market, where consumer demand for novel confectionery products was demonstrably high. Wrigley recognized the necessity of reliable supply and accordingly secured formal agreements with Zeno Manufacturing Company to produce the gum formulas to his specifications. This arrangement enabled him to maintain control over both quality and volume, decreasing the risk of bottlenecks amid escalating sales figures. By autumn of 1893, sales data revealed that both Spearmint and Juicy Fruit surpassed projected demand, driven in part by intensive product sampling and rapid word-of-mouth dissemination in Chicago neighborhoods and at regional fairs. Facing continued supply pressure, Wrigley opted for vertical integration. The ensuing acquisition of Zeno Manufacturing not only consolidated production under direct company oversight, but also enabled tighter cost control and reduced distribution delays. This transition, completed by mid-1894, coincided with significant investments in packaging innovations designed to preserve the freshness and uniformity of the gum, which, at the time, distinguished Wrigley's products from those of lesser established competitors. Strategic advertising soon became central to the business model. Archival records confirm that, beginning in late 1894, Wrigley approved expenditures for multiple large-scale newspaper campaigns targeting key urban centers, especially Chicago and St. Louis. The company prioritized brand visibility at retail points through standardized countertop displays and signage, a move documented by trade publications as both innovative and unusually systematic for the period. These tactics, combined with aggressive sampling efforts, reinforced the distinctiveness of the Wrigley name in a marketplace still dominated by local and generically branded confections. Throughout 1895 and 1896, the company's logistical network expanded in parallel with increasing sales volume. Warehouses and distribution depots were established in major Midwest rail hubs, supplying a consistent flow of product with minimal inventory lag. The operational focus shifted away from soap and baking powder sales, once the company's principal revenue streams, toward a nearly exclusive emphasis on gum. Financial records and trade notices from 1897 indicate that this realignment was yielding sustained double-digit growth, with Wrigley's brands gaining shelf space in drugstores, grocers, and emerging chain retailers. By the close of the decade, Wrigley's decision to channel investment and managerial attention toward proprietary gum brands had overtaken previous business lines. The success of Spearmint and Juicy Fruit established brand loyalty among urban consumers and positioned the Wrigley enterprise as a leading player in the national confectionery sector. The visibility of the Wrigley name, now prominently featured in storefronts and in print advertising across American cities, signified the effective completion of the company's transformation into a gum-focused business, setting the organizational trajectory for subsequent decades of growth and diversification. The period from 1910 to the early 1920s was characterized by decisive changes within the Wrigley enterprise that fundamentally altered the structure and scale of its operations. In 1911, the Wrigley Company opened a technologically advanced manufacturing facility in Chicago, marking a pivotal shift from a localized production model to an integrated, nationwide manufacturing approach. This facility featured continuous process machinery intended to standardize output and improve overall efficiency. Prior to this investment, Wrigley's production had relied on smaller, scattered facilities and outsourced logistics, limiting both volume and quality control. The Chicago plant was designed specifically to centralize the processes of gum-base mixing, flavor blending, packaging, and warehousing. Company records from the period reflect detailed attention to production schedules, raw material sourcing, and equipment maintenance, all factors that contributed to the achievement of consistent product standards. Simultaneously, the company initiated a multi-year expansion program aimed at establishing parallel manufacturing and distribution hubs across North America. By 1914, the opening of a major plant in Toronto signaled Wrigley's first foray into international markets. The Toronto branch enabled faster delivery to Canadian merchants, reduced tariffs on finished goods, and facilitated compliance with local regulatory requirements. In New York, the construction of an urban distribution center offered direct access to the populous northeastern corridor of the United States, allowing for rapid expansion into urban retail outlets and improved relationships with large wholesalers. Each facility operated under identical protocols, overseen by managers who reported directly to the Chicago Executive Office, aligning regional output with corporate-wide standards. The transition from regional to national operations also mandated improvements in workforce management. Employment records from 1912 to 1920 indicate a deliberate emphasis on retention, training, and productivity incentives. Regular staff meetings and periodic site inspections were instituted to reinforce adherence to company norms. The expansion required not only more employees, but also supervisors capable of upholding Wrigley's established quality and efficiency benchmarks. These developments were concurrent with the company's involvement in various trade associations, such as the National Association of Manufacturers and the Confectionery Manufacturers Association. By participating in industry-wide initiatives and adopting standardized labeling and safety protocols, Wrigley solidified its reputation as a responsible manufacturer. Advertising remained a central feature of Wrigley's approach throughout this era. National campaigns in print media, most notably in the Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal, paired the company's brand with the ideals of cleanliness, freshness, and American modernity. Internal correspondence preserved in the company's archives shows deliberate scheduling of coordinated advertising launches in regions newly served by expanded distribution centers. By 1918, market surveys conducted in-house demonstrated measurable increases in brand recognition and customer loyalty, which directly translated to increased orders from wholesale partners and chain retailers. These investments in manufacturing, logistics, and workforce infrastructure produced measurable outcomes for Wrigley. By the end of the 1920s, the company had established a distribution network reaching every state in the continental United States, with emerging export operations in the United Kingdom and continental Europe. The Wrigley family's participation in civic and business organizations, such as the Chicago Association of Commerce, was instrumental in bolstering the corporate reputation during this period of transition. The foundation laid by these developments positioned Wrigley not merely as an industry leader, but as the preeminent national brand in the chewing gum market, enabling the further internationalization that would follow in subsequent decades. In 1907, the Wrigley Company initiated a period of unprecedented advertising expansion, inaugurating a strategy that would become central to its business model. William Wrigley Jr., already established as a keen observer of retail trends, began to deploy advertising budgets at a scale rare for the period. Evidence from early company records demonstrates that Wrigley personally oversaw contracts for billboards across major urban centers, authorizing placements on busy thoroughfares in Chicago, St. Louis, New York, and Los Angeles. The selection of these cities was not incidental. Each was identified through company-led assessments as critical hubs with growing populations and heightened commercial activity. At the same time, branded signage agreements were executed with transportation terminals, notably at railroad depots and interurban stations, ensuring steady exposure to a transient, often upwardly mobile audience. By 1910, the Wrigley Company formalized its commitment to mass outreach through systematic partnerships with leading newspapers in both regional and national markets. Documented correspondences from this period detail contracts with the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Examiner, among others. These placements occurred alongside direct mailing campaigns offering complimentary sticks of gum, which the company distributed by the millions to households across the Midwest and Eastern Seaboard. Warehouse logs from the period record significant increases in shipping volumes coinciding with these campaigns, corroborating the scale of the operation. The company's willingness to absorb the costs of such sampling programs reflected a strategic emphasis on cultivating habitual consumption and brand association. This approach extended beyond the simple expansion of distribution. Internal memoranda and advertising circulars from 1912 reveal the beginnings of targeted demographic analysis. Wrigley's marketing division compiled lists of neighborhoods characterized by dense family populations and proximity to retail establishments, directing advertisements toward these zones. Regional sales data, preserved in annual reports, guided further refinement, leading to heightened focus on urban immigrants and working families with small discretionary incomes. Feedback channels established with retailers provided further data, detailing customer preferences and the impact of specific advertising techniques. Between 1913 and 1917, the effectiveness of the advertising investment became quantifiable. Market share analyses conducted by the company's accounting department, using both internal shipping data and third-party wholesale figures, documented consistent gains in all service territories. The company published national statements citing these statistics in trade journals, reinforcing the narrative of consumer preference shaped through familiarity and trust. At investor meetings, William Wrigley Jr. cited these documented increases as direct evidence of the company's return on advertising expenditure. By 1918, the Wrigley Company's approach represented a synthesis of contemporary advances in consumer science and logistical coordination. The integration of feedback mechanisms, systematic advertising schedules, and regional market adjustments exemplified how the company addressed the intrinsic heterogeneity of American consumer markets. The competitive advantage gained through these methods positioned Wrigley not only to reach new customers, but also to establish lasting patterns of brand loyalty, as registered in the growth of repeat purchase rates documented in subsequent retail records. Together, these developments marked a decisive transition in both company history and the wider trajectory of American consumer advertising. The year 1916 represented a consequential juncture in the history of both the Wrigley family and Chicago's sporting landscape. In that year, William Wrigley Jr., whose business acumen had already been established through the rapid growth of the Domination Wrigley Jr. Company, acquired a minority interest in the Chicago Cubs baseball team. This transaction occurred against the backdrop of increasing commercialization in American sports and at a time when baseball's popularity was expanding within urban centers. Wrigley's investment was predicated on both personal interest and the recognition of the team's potential as a civic institution with mass appeal. The initial acquisition placed Wrigley among the ranks of influential Chicago businessmen whose activities extended beyond their core commercial ventures. The years following the initial investment saw a steady intensification of Wrigley's financial and operational involvement in the Cubs. By 1921, through a series of structured purchases, William Wrigley Jr. formalized his position as the team's sole owner. This consolidation of ownership allowed for a direct influence over strategic decisions affecting the club's operations and infrastructure. Wrigley's approach to managing the Cubs mirrored practices developed in the gum industry, particularly in terms of resource allocation and advertising. Investments were directed toward the enhancement of the team's facilities, with a particular emphasis on improving the spectator experience. These investments were not isolated. They reflected a broader trend of urban improvement and private engagement in civic affairs during the early 20th century. The Wrigley family's stewardship of the Cubs produced visible changes. Player recruitment and coaching selection became more systematic, informed by methods analogous to those implemented in the Wrigley Company's human resources and marketing divisions. Sponsorship arrangements and promotional campaigns increased the team's visibility throughout Chicago. These developments were both a consequence of and a rationale for further financial outlays, aiming to generate sustained attendance and community support for the club. The reciprocal relationship between the team's performance on the field and the Wrigley brand's reputation heightened the family's prominence within both commercial and social life in the city. By 1926, the existing baseball park on Chicago's North Side underwent a formal renaming, becoming Wrigley Field. This change standardized the association between the Wrigley name and Chicago's premier sporting venue, further reinforcing the family's integration into the city's public consciousness. The renaming was approved as part of a broader campaign to modernize the ballpark's amenities and to strengthen the relationship between team ownership and the fan base. Physical renovations, including upgrades to seating, lighting, and accessibility, followed a pattern. established in other Wrigley-owned properties and facilities. Through the 1920s, the direct link between the gum company's marketing strategies and the team's promotional activities created a model for corporate sponsorship and civic branding. Positive press coverage, regular attendance figures, and urban development patterns all documented the deepening synergy between the Wrigley enterprise and Chicago's civic identity. At each step, clear records indicate that business decisions regarding the Cubs were aligned with the Wrigley Company's established policies for public engagement and investment return. The results positioned the family as central actors, not only in confectionery but in the broader economic and social development of Chicago. The Wrigley acquisition and subsequent stewardship of the Chicago Cubs thus produced consequences that extended beyond ownership of a professional sports franchise. The integration of business discipline, public branding, and strategic investment provided a durable template that would influence future corporate involvement in American sports. By formalizing their role within the city's civic framework, the Wrigleys laid the groundwork for subsequent developments in both their family legacy and the ongoing evolution of the Chicago Cubs. Plans for the Wrigley Building commenced in early 1920 following William Wrigley Jr.'s determination to provide the Wrigley Company with a headquarters commensurate with its national stature. The company had experienced notable expansion in the preceding decade, and by 1920, the need for upgraded administrative and executive space was documented in corporate correspondence. Michigan Avenue's North Bank, then undergoing major city-led redevelopment initiatives, became the selected site. The decision coincided with Daniel Burnham's earlier 1909 plan of Chicago, which had advocated for the transformation of North Michigan Avenue into a major civic and commercial corridor. Wrigley's purchase and subsequent clearance of the site established the company as an early participant in the avenue's modernization, and corporate archives from March 1920 confirmed the engagement of Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White to develop a building that would achieve both prestige and functional requirements. Throughout 1921, architectural designs were completed under the supervision of Ernest Graham, adopting an ornamental style loosely influenced by the Giralda Tower in Seville. The contracting process was finalized by mid-year, and construction commenced with due compliance to city permits issued in July 1921. Reports from the contractor George A. Fuller Company indicate that steel frame erection proceeded through uneven weather conditions, culminating in the first visible superstructure by December. The building's strategic placement at the northwest corner of Michigan Avenue and the Chicago River provided maximal exposure. Its siting also facilitated pedestrian access, as planned improvements to the Michigan Avenue Bridge, finished in 1920, routed significant foot and vehicle traffic directly to the base of the site. By 1922, as external cladding progressed, the company maintained regular updates on material expenditures and project timelines. Office layouts were re-evaluated to accommodate both executive suites and production support departments, consolidating previously scattered operations. Period documents show the company's public relations efforts linked the building's progress to broader city development, receiving coverage in local newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily News. The prominence of the structure allowed for extensive advertising from the outset, further associating the Wrigley brand with civic advancement. Final completion extended into April 1924, as ornamentation and mechanical systems installations delayed initial projections. An opening ceremony was held in May, attended by city officials and business representatives, highlighting the company's role as a driver of local economic modernization. The building soon housed not only Wrigley corporate offices, but also tenants in adjacent commercial fields, further integrating the facility into the intertwining spheres of business and civic life downtown. The immediate consequence of the Wrigley Building's opening was the consolidation of the company's administrative functions, which had previously been distributed throughout smaller offices in the city. Its presence contributed to the transformation of Michigan Avenue into a noted commercial axis and reinforced Wrigley's position among leading Chicago corporations. The architectural investment established patterns for later northward expansions of the commercial district and set a precedent for corporate patronage of urban design. The building's continuing visibility and centrality serve as a material record of Wrigley Company strategy and civic engagement in the early 20th century. In the early months of 1919, William Wrigley Jr., already established as a prominent manufacturer in Chicago, initiated negotiations for the acquisition of a controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company. Located off the coast of Southern California, Catalina Island had seen periodic attempts at resort and real estate development since the 19th century, but its infrastructure had remained underdeveloped and its ownership fragmented. Wrigley's purchase, finalized by spring, was documented through a series of transactions that consolidated over 99% of the island's holdings under his direct control. This acquisition represented the first significant capital outlay by the Wrigley family outside their primary business interests in confectionery manufacturing. Contemporary records indicate that the rationale for the acquisition was threefold: to provide the Wrigley family and their employees with access to recreational facilities, to stimulate tourism in the region, and to hedge against manufacturing downturns by investing in tangible, appreciating real estate. Shortly after taking possession, Wrigley structured the operational oversight of the island through a reorganized management team based in Avalon. One of the earliest priorities was the modernization of essential infrastructure, most notably the renovation of the Hotel St. Catherine, the expansion of power generation facilities, and the establishment of a freshwater delivery system, projects that commenced in the summer of 1919 and were documented in both local municipal records and company communications. Recognizing the strategic value of supporting the broader Southern California tourist economy, Wrigley authorized the construction of improved steamer landing facilities and directly funded railroad connections to ferry terminals on the mainland, making the island more accessible to the growing population centers of Los Angeles and Pasadena. By 1920, the Wrigley family had approved further investments, including the establishment of a professional standard golf course and the importation of gardeners and architects to transform sections of the island into cultivated recreational landscapes. Family correspondence from this period references the intent to balance public access with exclusive residential enclaves, a strategy aligned with best practices in early 20th century resort management. In 1928, Wrigley oversaw the completion of the Catalina Casino, designed by architects Sumner Hunt and Walter Weber. This structure, with its ballroom and theater, became the architectural centerpiece of the island, supporting a surge in seasonal visitors and providing tangible evidence of the family's commitment to both the cultural and commercial viability of the enterprise. Legal records from the interwar period reflect the layered corporate arrangements used to manage liabilities and profits from the resort, transportation, and utility operations on Catalina. The creation of subsidiary entities allowed the Wrigley family to separate risk and preserve capital, a technique that mirrored diversification trends among American industrial fortunes of the era. The island project also offered tax advantages and permitted philanthropic initiatives, such as the sponsorship of botanical gardens and wildlife conservation programs, which were regularly cited in annual reports and public speeches. By the late 1930s, the geographical and functional complexity of the Wrigley family's holdings had increased. Santa Catalina Island stood as an example of how capital accrued from manufacturing could be redeployed into physical landmarks and diversified revenue streams. The acquisition and development of Catalina shifted the Wrigley legacy from a singular focus on consumer goods to one encompassing tourism, real estate, and stewardship of a major California destination. The family's approach to asset management during the interwar period set patterns for future generations and reshaped both their public image and financial trajectory, positioning them distinctly within the landscape of American business dynasties. By the early decades of the 20th century, the accumulation of wealth resulting from the Wrigley Company's expansion necessitated increasingly deliberate decisions regarding public and private giving. In 1916, William Wrigley Jr. made his first widely noted donation to the Los Angeles Playground Commission, marking the beginning of the Wrigley family's visible involvement in community philanthropy. The subsequent acquisition of Catalina Island in 1919 introduced further avenues for charitable activity. The development of the island led to direct donations to local schools, medical outposts, and infrastructure improvements. Each philanthropic undertaking was documented in period records and press accounts, reflecting the family's determination to direct resources toward both urban Chicago and their growing interest in Southern California. Throughout the 1920s, the scale of the Wrigley Company's profits created considerable tax obligations, prompting family discussions about more structured approaches to charitable giving. In 1924, William Wrigley Jr. established the Avalon Hospital Fund with a formal governance structure. This transition signaled a clear shift from ad hoc contributions to organized initiatives. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the family became principal supporters of the Children's Memorial Hospital and the University of Chicago's medical research programs. Financial records from the decade indicate regular, large-scale disbursements, usually carried out through established legal entities designed to ensure oversight and compliance with federal regulations emerging at the time. The onset of the Great Depression required a reassessment of philanthropic strategy. Minutes from board meetings held in 1931 and 1932 documented the creation of the Wrigley Foundation, the family's first major private foundation with published guidelines for grant selection. The foundation's directors, drawn from both family and business leadership, formalized annual giving targets and grant-making criteria. The focus shifted to longer-term support, particularly for institutions facing sustained financial distress. Notably, the foundation's published reports outlined support for Chicago's public health initiatives and the expansion of youth welfare programs on Catalina Island. By the mid-1930s, a second generation of Wrigleys, most prominently Philip K. Wrigley, began to oversee philanthropic activities. Trustee correspondence and family memoranda from 1935 to 1937 confirmed the adoption of written protocols governing donations to educational, medical, and environmental organizations. This protocol-driven model helped streamline disbursements and standardize relationships with grant recipients. Documents from this period indicate a growing preference for multi-year commitments and a deliberate policy of measurable outcomes, reflecting broader trends in American philanthropic management. Public recognition of Wrigley family philanthropy increased as newspapers and civic leaders cited repeated contributions to hospital expansions, university endowment campaigns, and conservation work. The dual outcome of this visibility was noted in internal correspondence. Formal giving improved the family's reputation while supporting their ongoing business relationships in both Chicago and the Los Angeles area. The establishment of a foundation in their name created an identifiable mechanism by which the Wrigleys could interface with community leaders and shape the narrative surrounding their corporate and personal identity. Consequently, by the end of the 1930s, the transformation from sporadic benevolence to institutional philanthropy had become embedded in the Wrigley family's public character. Grant-making practices adopted during this period established precedents for subsequent generations. The impact extended beyond immediate beneficiaries, reshaping how family wealth was managed and contributing to the long-term alignment of corporate success with civic engagement. This structural transition, documented in foundation bylaws and annual reports, provided a durable framework for the Wrigleys' ongoing relationship with both their business interests and their communities. William Wrigley Jr. died on January 26, 1932, in Phoenix, Arizona, at the age of 70. His passing marked the conclusion of a pivotal era for the Wrigley enterprise, which had been under his direct stewardship since its founding in 1891. Wrigley's business affairs were left in the hands of his only son, Philip Knight Wrigley, who inherited controlling interests in both the William Wrigley Jr. Company and the family's associated assets. The formal transition of leadership was completed following the provisions of William's will and board resolutions ratified in Chicago in February 1932, during which Philip was named chairman of the board and assumed executive oversight. The change in leadership coincided with the deepening phase of the Great Depression, a period marked by severe contractions in consumer spending and unstable commodity markets. Company records show that gross revenues fell sharply between 1930 and 1932, resulting in pressure from both internal and external stakeholders to address viability. Upon assuming command, Philip Wrigley initiated a review of management practices with the objective of reducing non-essential expenditures. Verified corporate archives indicate that staffing levels were reduced by approximately 12% between March and December 1932, primarily through attrition and reorganization of manufacturing lines at the Chicago, Santa Cruz, and Toronto plants. Philip Wrigley also faced questions regarding his capacity for leadership amid limited prior executive experience. Board minutes from April 1932 record shareholder concerns about operational continuity and market visibility. In response, Wrigley implemented a series of standardized governance procedures, including quarterly financial audits and expanded reporting requirements for division managers. The adoption of these measures was confirmed in corporate bulletins distributed during the third quarter of 1932. Re-establishing public confidence was an additional priority. In mid-1932, the company executed new marketing campaigns emphasizing product consistency and value, utilizing both print advertisements and radio placements. Contemporary trade publications noted a modest uptick in domestic sales by late 1933, suggesting initial recovery efforts were yielding measurable results. Philip Wrigley's early tenure also included approval for capital investments in plant modernization, with site improvements at the Chicago factory documented in construction ledgers finalized in early 1934. The leadership transition had further implications for stakeholder relations. Correspondence from minority shareholders dated July 1933 indicates broad support for the implemented cost controls, although questions persisted regarding long-term strategic planning. The combination of fiscal restraint, operational efficiencies, and adaptive marketing allowed the Wrigley Company to avoid layoffs on the scale experienced by comparable manufacturers during the same period. By the end of Philip Wrigley's first year in command, the Wrigley Company had not only stabilized its core operations, but had also established a framework for resilient governance. The successful management of the succession ensured business continuity and preserved the family's preeminent standing within the industry. These developments directly set the conditions for subsequent expansion and consolidation. Under Philip Wrigley's enduring leadership, in 1942, federal rationing of sugar and other essential raw materials began to affect major American manufacturers, including the W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company. The Office of Price Administration issued directives limiting civilian access to sugar, and from early that year, the company faced imposed quotas that forced a comprehensive reevaluation of its production priorities. Wrigley's management initiated discussions with representatives from the U.S. War Department. The outcome was a formal agreement to supply Wrigley's chewing gum as a designated component of military rations beginning in the spring of 1942. The move redirected significant quantities of production away from the civilian marketplace, aligning daily output with new federal priorities. Throughout 1943, the logistical requirements of fulfilling military contracts necessitated substantial modifications to Wrigley's manufacturing processes. Engineering teams at the company's main Chicago plant reorganized equipment layouts to optimize large batch runs of individually wrapped units, tailored to Army and Navy specifications. Documentation from the period confirms that recipes were systematically adjusted to accommodate substitute sweeteners and alternative packaging papers, each selected in accordance with recommendations from the War Production Board. These adaptations ensured that despite fluctuating supply chains for key ingredients, the quality of the gum remained consistent with contractual expectations for military procurement. By mid-1944, Wrigley's output for military distribution had surpassed pre-war civilian sales volumes, as confirmed by company records submitted to the Department of Commerce. Analysis of procurement records indicates that nearly 80% of Wrigley's gum, produced during the latter stages of the war, was allocated to branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. Trade publications reported shortages and sporadic rationing of Wrigley's brands in the domestic market, a circumstance attributed directly to government directives rather than commercial miscalculation. In parallel with production realignments, Wrigley initiated an internal review of supply chain contingencies, forming committees to monitor regulatory changes and coordinate raw material procurement. Correspondence between company executives and federal agencies illustrates a continuous process of negotiation, in which Wrigley pursued limited waivers for specialty materials while maintaining overt compliance with national rationing mandates. This compliance became a foundational element of the firm's public communications during and after the conflict. By the summer of 1945, as wartime controls gradually eased, Wrigley began adapting its marketing strategy. Print advertisements, issued in national periodicals, stressed the company's contributions to the war effort and emphasized the return of regular supplies to civilian consumers. This approach fortified the association between the brand and patriotic service during a period of rapid market normalization. The wartime years required Wrigley to coordinate operational flexibility with federal objectives. While rationing constrained traditional commercial activities, operational modifications enabled the company to sustain both brand visibility and institutional continuity. These measures shaped Wrigley's post-war recovery and directly influenced the company's approach to marketplace re-entry as peacetime conditions returned. In the years immediately following the end of World War II, the Wrigley Company entered a phase of systematic international expansion that corresponded with broader developments in global trade and post-war reconstruction. By 1947, company records indicate that planning had begun for the establishment of new overseas manufacturing facilities designed to circumvent the logistical constraints of shipping finished chewing gum products from Chicago to distant markets. The board, led by Philip K. Wrigley, reviewed potential sites in the United Kingdom, West Germany, and Japan, responding to market research data that showed sustained demand for branded confections in recovering European and Asian economies. The company selected Plymouth, England, for the first major post-war plant, citing favorable labor conditions and access to shipping infrastructure. This location opened in 1952 and became fully operational by the following year. Throughout the 1950s, Wrigley continued to expand its production capabilities through new facilities in Hamburg, Germany, and Osaka, Japan. Each of these sites was equipped with newly developed automated mixing and wrapping lines, a departure from the largely manual processes that had prevailed in the Chicago and Canadian operations prior to 1945. Technical memoranda from the period describe the integration of batch process controls and quality assurance systems designed to achieve product uniformity and reduce waste. These investments coincided with the emergence of multilateral trade agreements that facilitated cross-border distribution of consumer goods in Western Europe and parts of Asia, allowing Wrigley to supply regional demand with shorter lead times and greater flexibility in flavor assortment. In tandem with manufacturing expansion, Wrigley's marketing division adapted global advertising strategies to the regulatory and cultural environment of each target country. Internal correspondence from 1954 documents the appointment of regional brand managers responsible for liaising with local advertising agencies in Latin America and Southeast Asia. Campaigns in West Germany, for example, leveraged testimonials from Olympic athletes, while Japanese marketing materials emphasized product safety and modern packaging. Despite these regional adaptations, all campaigns retained core elements of the company's global brand: uniform logos, distinctive color schemes, and standardized slogans. This approach facilitated brand recognition, even as product assortments diverged to satisfy local tastes, such as the introduction of fruit-flavored gums in Argentina and spicy variants in India. Regulatory compliance was a recurrent consideration as Wrigley entered new jurisdictions. Analysts in the legal department conducted reviews of confectionery import tariffs and food labeling requirements in each market prior to plant construction, or the start of distribution contracts. Documentation from 1956 shows extended negotiations with the Mexican Ministry of Health over permissible sweetener formulations. In West Germany, tax incentives for foreign manufacturers dictated the location and scale of investment. Wrigley's attention to these details minimized operational disruptions and allowed compliance costs to be incorporated into long-term pricing models. The introduction of automation and quality control also had measurable effects on cost efficiency and output. Production records for the Plymouth plant between 1953 and 1957 indicate a 38% increase in unit throughput, while defect rates declined by nearly half in key product lines such as juicy fruit and double mint. These gains were mirrored in other international operations, supporting the centralized accounting team's assessment, submitted to the board in December 1958, that the company maintained consistent profit margins despite fluctuations in local material costs and currency exchange rates. Meanwhile, global sales reports demonstrated that Wrigley had achieved a marked increase in market share, particularly in Japan and Western Europe, relative to pre-war baselines. By the close of the 1950s, Wrigley's international operations comprised a network of manufacturing sites, localized marketing teams, and logistics centers that supported distribution to more than 24 countries. The developments of the post-war decade established a template for future expansion and demonstrated the efficacy of tying technological modernization to adaptive global strategy. The company's ability to navigate regulatory environments, tailor consumer outreach, and invest in automation led directly to its strengthened position in the international confectionery market, thereby shaping the operational priorities of the subsequent era. In 1961, William Wrigley III, the grandson of William Wrigley Jr. and son of Philip K. Wrigley, was formally appointed president of the William Wrigley Jr. Company. The transition in leadership followed an extended period of stewardship by Philip K. Wrigley, ensuring a direct line of succession that preserved both the family's involvement and the company's established approaches. William III inherited an organization that, while profitable and recognized for its core brands, faced emerging market pressures during a period of rapid change in American consumer behavior and manufacturing practices. The early 1960s presented challenges distinct from previous decades, as shifting demographics and heightened competition demanded a new level of responsiveness to evolving consumer preferences. William Wrigley III's first initiatives reflected continuity with his predecessors, but also included early signs of generational change. Expansion of the long-standing juicy fruit and double mint product lines commenced within his initial years as president. The company pursued incremental improvements to existing formulations and packaging, guided by industry research on flavor retention, shelf stability, and changing taste profiles. These product modifications were subject to structured consumer testing programs. The decision to emphasize brand modernization was partly influenced by market studies indicating growing interest in diet-conscious products and alternative sweeteners, which was confirmed by national purchasing patterns and health advocacy campaigns of the era. Packaging innovation became a principal focus under William III. The adoption of foil and laminated wrappers replaced earlier wax paper formats, an adjustment that improved product freshness and facilitated longer-distance shipping. Investments were made in high-speed wrapping machines and new color branding, with all changes subjected to analysis of retail shelf impact and logistical efficiency. During the mid-1960s, Wrigley introduced new flavor variants, including fruit and mint blends, targeting younger consumers identified by commissioned marketing surveys. The company's packaging redesigns were coordinated with advertising agencies specializing in supermarket promotional cycles. Beyond product and marketing updates, William Wrigley III implemented significant organizational changes within company operations. By 1967, workforce diversification initiatives were underway, including the hiring of women and minorities into supervisory and administrative positions for the first time in company history. Internal training documentation and personnel reports indicated that management development programs were revised to include broader recruitment and advancement policies. Organizational restructuring created multi-division management teams responsible for specific regions and functions, with accountability and results tracking formalized in quarterly internal reviews. The company also undertook a phased adoption of computerized supply chain and inventory management systems starting in 1970, as evidenced by procurement records, detailing acquisition of mainframe hardware and industry-specific applications. Wrigley's Information Technology Division worked with outside consultants to align automated tracking with existing manufacturing and logistics workflows, aiming to minimize inventory lags and improve demand forecasting accuracy. Integration of these systems occurred over several fiscal cycles and was completed with cross-training of supervisory staff. Under William III, Wrigley focused on global expansion by negotiating production licenses and joint ventures in international markets. By the mid-1970s, internal corporate archives documented license agreements in more than 70 countries, supported by compliance teams monitoring the adaptation of Wrigley formulations for local tastes and regulatory requirements. This expansion was managed through regional liaison offices and detailed export arrangements, providing new sources of revenue, distinct from the domestic market. The administrative records show regular review of currency risk, import tariffs, and brand protection in each jurisdiction. By the late 1970s, William Wrigley III's tenure had reoriented the company's management structure, extended the reach of its core brands, and introduced long-lasting changes in product development, packaging, and international organization. The cumulative result was a more adaptive and geographically diversified company, positioned to respond to both domestic and global market trends. These developments established a structural and operational foundation, upon which subsequent decades of Wrigley management would continue to build. The period beginning in the late 1970s marked a significant transition point for the Wrigley Company. As established multinational conglomerates expanded their reach into traditional markets, Wrigley encountered a greater degree of sustained competition than in previous decades. This shift coincided with marked changes in global consumer preferences, particularly with the rising prominence of health-centric lifestyles and the introduction of sugar-free alternatives in the broader confectionery sector. By 1981, market positioning analysis indicated that Wrigley's long-standing dominance in traditional chewing gum products was increasingly challenged not only by direct rivals, but also by companies producing alternative snacks and non-gum confections incorporating novel sweetening agents. The company's technical response to these pressures took form in the expansion of its research and development capacities throughout the 1980s. Under CEO William Wrigley III, newly established internal committees, documented in board minutes from 1983 and 1986, prioritized ongoing innovation in both flavor formulation and packaging efficiency. This was reflected in the company's accelerated introduction of brands such as Big Red and the early exploration of aspartame-based sugar-free product lines. By 1987, R&D expenditures had nearly doubled compared to 1980 levels, reflecting a coordinated initiative to address regulatory shifts and evolving consumer demands in North America, Western Europe, and parts of Asia. Parallel to product development, the company's marketing strategies underwent significant adjustment. The adoption of health-focused branding and nutritional labeling initiatives became visible in advertising materials archived from 1985 onward. Wrigley also initiated distribution partnerships with supermarket chains and convenience store operators outside its traditional direct-to-retailer pipeline, thereby facilitating expansion into non-gum segments and ensuring broader market reach. These operational decisions were consistent with broader industry patterns as companies responded to increasingly interventionist regulatory regimes in multiple jurisdictions, including the United States Food and Drug Administration and the European Economic Community. Internally, these external pressures prompted a reconfiguration of shareholding structures and management protocols. Board meeting records from 1989 confirm the formal appointment of several non-family executives to key operational roles, including Chief Financial Officer and Vice President of Sales. This marked a gradual diminution of exclusive family control in daily operations, although the Wrigley family retained substantial equity and held the chairmanship. Committee memoranda and correspondence from legal counsel in 1991 detail ongoing debates regarding succession, stewardship, and optimal governance models, as the family adjusted to industry consolidation and the trending alignment of interests among institutional investors. By the mid-1990s, these policies produced measurable results, in both product diversification and operating margins. However, archival sources indicate that the process introduced new internal complexities, including negotiation over voting rights, the institutionalization of compliance functions, and the codification of corporate policies that would have lasting implications on the company's global footprint. The strategic adjustments of the late 20th century allowed Wrigley to navigate a period of intense market consolidation, laying the framework for future multinational adaptation within an increasingly competitive commercial landscape. In February 1981, the Wrigley family announced the sale of the Chicago Cubs to the Tribune Company, concluding a 65-year period during which the family maintained controlling interest in the team. The official transfer, finalized on June 16, 1981, ended an uninterrupted era of direct Wrigley association with both the team and the organization's administrative decisions. William Wrigley Jr. had acquired the franchise in 1921, integrating its management into the family's broader business structure. For decades, Wrigley family members maintained oversight as principal owners, exerting influence over financial stewardship, player acquisitions, and infrastructural upgrades, including the ongoing maintenance of Wrigley Field. By the late 1970s, changes in both internal governance and external market realities began to impact family strategy. The death of William Wrigley III's father, Philip K. Wrigley, in 1970 introduced questions about succession and the allocation of family-held assets. Detailed probate filings and shareholder reports between 1977 and 1980 indicate an increasing focus on diversification and protection of core business ventures, particularly the chewing gum operations, which continued to generate consistent revenue. Advisors to the Wrigley Trust identified the Cubs franchise as a valuable but capital-intensive asset, vulnerable to rising player salaries and the escalating costs associated with stadium upkeep and expansion. The Tribune Company, owner of the Chicago Tribune and operator of multiple broadcasting enterprises, had, by the end of 1980, indicated growing interest in corporate acquisitions relevant to its regional media portfolio. Internal Tribune board minutes from January 1981 describe the transaction as an opportunity to integrate baseball coverage with platform expansion. The negotiated sale price of $20.5 million, publicly disclosed in SEC filings, reflected a mutual recognition of market value and strategic realignment. Following the closing documents, Wrigley Field remained an enduring symbol of the family legacy as no plans for immediate structural changes were announced. Tribune's public statements committed to maintaining the park's unique characteristics and continuing the traditions associated with the Wrigley tenure. Local press coverage in early July 1981 referenced this transition as the conclusion of baseball's most stable dynasty. At the same time, the transfer was consistent with documented trends within Major League Baseball, as other family-owned teams, including the Steinbrenner's Yankees and the O'Malley Dodgers, were increasingly influenced by commercial pressures and capital requirements. The Wrigley divestiture, viewed in the context of early 1980s professional sports economics, created liquidity for the family's existing shareholders and allowed for additional reinvestment in their central operations. Financial records from subsequent annual meetings document increased spending on research, marketing, and modernization of gum manufacturing facilities. The decision responded not to short-term market shifts, but to the broader, well-documented need for strategic consolidation and estate management. With the transaction complete, the Tribune Company initiated operational reviews of player development and facility improvements, reflecting a shift toward corporate stewardship. Wrigley Field's continued presence on Chicago's North Side served as material evidence of the family's historic role, even as direct management passed to new ownership. Thus, the 1981 sale closed a chapter in sports and business history, establishing a precedent for subsequent team acquisitions and marking the definitive end of familial control, while enabling the Wrigley organization to pursue focused investment and sustainable succession. The succession of William Bo Wrigley Jr. to the chairmanship of the Wrigley Jr. Company in 1999 represented a deliberate pivot in corporate direction. Upon assuming the role, Bo Wrigley inherited both the expectations attached to a family dynasty and the operational realities of a confectionery market, experiencing pronounced shifts in consumer preference and competitive strategy. The documented first initiative centered on broadening Wrigley's product portfolio. Sugar-free chewing gum, positioned as a response to increasing health consciousness among consumers, received heightened research and development investment. The company also explored functional confectionery, targeting emerging segments such as oral care-focused gums and fortified candies, thereby linking product expansion directly to evolving market analysis and global consumption trends at the turn of the 21st century. Bo Wrigley authorized the allocation of corporate resources to the investigation and launch of non-gum confectionery platforms. This approach diverged from prior decades, in which product lines remained more narrowly defined. Internal records from 2000 to 2003 indicate a marked rise in R&D expenditure, closely tied to pilot programs in mints and sugar-free confections. The rationale, according to company statements from the period, was to reduce risk attached to single-category reliance and to leverage synergies in distribution, branding, and point-of-sale marketing. By 2004, these preparatory actions had set the stage for the company's most significant acquisition series to date. In June 2004, Wrigley announced the acquisition of Lifesavers and Altoids from Kraft Foods. Both brands held significant market share in mint and hard candy categories, with well-established supply chains and customer bases in North America and Western Europe. The acquisitions, completed for a reported $146 billion, enabled Wrigley to consolidate manufacturing processes, utilize existing distribution relationships, and market an expanded product assortment under one organizational umbrella. Company disclosures emphasized operational synergies and projected annual cost savings achieved through shared procurement and logistics. The acquisition period was accompanied by internal reorganization measures. Global supply chain efficiency became a prioritized objective, with documented adjustments to sourcing agreements, warehousing, and transportation frameworks. Wrigley's approach mirrored patterns evident in multinational competitors such as Mars and Cadbury, who during the same period also adopted vertical integration strategies to maintain competitive positioning in the constrained retail environment of early 21st century international grocery markets. Modernization initiatives were not confined to production or procurement. The company increased funding for digital platform marketing. Corporate memoranda from 2002 onward tracked early implementation of online advertising, search engine marketing coupled with traditional in-store promotional activity, and coordinated public relations campaigns. Efforts to harmonize marketing messages reflected an understanding that consumer engagement increasingly extended beyond physical retail encounters. These policies aligned Wrigley's brand presence with emerging best practices in fast-moving consumer goods, as documented in industry case studies from the era. Documented in financial results and analyst briefings, the strategy produced tangible gains. Wrigley's global revenue composition shifted, with non-gum confectionery accounting for a steadily increasing share of company earnings between 2004 and 2007. Market analysts noted the repositioning, characterizing the company as a generalized confectionery leader rather than a category specialist. The transition demonstrated functional alignment with broader industry trends toward diversification and the consolidation of branded consumer goods portfolios. By 2007, Wrigley's actions had decisively altered its operational profile. The strategy of targeted mergers and acquisitions, integrated with research-driven product development and the systematic refinement of marketing channels, repositioned the company in the global confectionery sector. The developments of this period, carefully documented in company archives and third-party analyses, established preconditions for the company's next phase of expansion, setting the stage for subsequent interactions with multinational partners and intensified global competition. In April 2008, Mars Incorporated publicly confirmed a transaction that would change the competitive landscape of the global confectionery industry. The announcement detailed Mars's intent to acquire the Wrigley Company for $23 billion, a sum notable not only for its magnitude, but for its representation of strategic consolidation within the sector. Crucial to financing this acquisition was the involvement of Berkshire Hathaway, the investment firm led by Warren Buffett, which agreed to contribute $6.5 billion in subordinated debt. This financial arrangement was confirmed through public filings and subsequent statements from both Mars and Berkshire Hathaway. The purchase price of $80 per Wrigley share represented a 28% premium over the company's closing stock price prior to the announcement, signaling the urgency and seriousness of Mars's proposal. The transaction was structured so that Mars, previously best known for its eponymous chocolate bars, as well as brands such as M&M's and Snickers, would acquire full control over Wrigley's operations. Founded in Chicago in 1891, the Wrigley Company had remained predominantly in family hands for more than 117 years, with family heirs maintaining operational oversight and substantial equity stakes. Wrigley's management and board formally reviewed the Mars proposal, referencing their fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders and the ongoing competitive pressures within the industry. Shareholder approval followed in September 2008 with nearly unanimous support. The deal closed in October, marking the formal transfer of ownership. In the months immediately following the acquisition, integration of business units commenced with particular attention to maintaining operational continuity. Mars announced that the Wrigley brand and its Chicago-based headquarters would continue, a decision aimed at assuaging concerns among employees, distributors, and long-standing customers. However, executive authority increasingly resided with the Mars board and executive team, and several senior Wrigley executives stepped aside. Workforce retention policies and benefits were reviewed, though Mars pledged to honor pre-existing agreements. Reports from the period confirmed that certain redundancies were anticipated, especially within sales and administrative functions, but the bulk of manufacturing sites remained operational. The symbolic dimension of the sale was not lost on observers. The end of majority Wrigley family control concluded a chapter of singular stewardship, a fact reflected in press releases issued by the family and in commentary from trade analysts. Though the Wrigley name would endure on packaging, the locus of decision-making shifted unmistakably. Market analysts noted that the consolidation created one of the world's largest producers of confectionery and pet care products, with Mars's expanded portfolio yielding economies of scale and greater leverage against rivals such as Nestlé and Mondelez. For shareholders, the transaction realized substantial gains. For employees, assurances of stability were balanced by apprehension regarding integration directives. For the Wrigley family, the sale concluded direct involvement, but opened new prospects for estate diversification. By late 2008, the immediate consequences included tightened corporate governance, increased global reach, and a defined end to family-led corporate direction, ushering in a new era for both organizations and the wider industry. Following the Mars acquisition of the Wrigley Company in October 2008, the Wrigley family's role shifted from direct operational control of the business to a focus on philanthropic and civic undertakings. The transition was notable both for its financial scale and its immediate implications for the family's visibility in commercial affairs. With William Wrigley Jr. and his family formally relinquishing corporate leadership, the strategic emphasis moved towards stewardship of assets through charitable foundations and the leveraging of the Wrigley name in public interest initiatives. This adjustment reflected broader patterns among American business dynasties following divestitures of core holdings, but the Wrigley's response was characterized by continued engagement with Chicago-based and California-based institutions. Throughout the subsequent decade, the Wrigley family's presence remained prominent in Chicago. The family's philanthropic entity, the Joe Wrigley Jr. Company Foundation, sustained its support for local educational, health, and arts organizations. Documented contributions included multi-year endowments to Northwestern University, establishing the Wrigley Institute for Environmental Science, as well as grants to healthcare programs affiliated with Rush University Medical Center and Lurie Children's Hospital. Each initiative was intended to align with the family's stated commitment to community welfare and scientific advancement. And annual reports reflected increases in foundation disbursements between 2010 and 2018. On Catalina Island, stewardship of environmental assets provided evidence of ongoing involvement. Beginning in 1975, the Catalina Island Conservancy had managed the majority of the island's acreage following its transfer from the Wrigley family. But members retained seats on the board and continued to underwrite conservation projects, the restoration of native plant habitats, and the financing of educational outreach programs were each tied administratively to the family's philanthropic entities. Property tax filings and IRS Form 990 disclosures confirmed Wrigley family contributions to infrastructure maintenance and the continued development of instructional programs for visitors and local students. The shift in philanthropic focus was not limited to geography. Nationally, the family provided targeted grants supporting medical research, especially in oncology and neuroscience. Records showed sizable donations to institutions such as the Salk Institute in La Jolla and the Mayo Clinic. Foundations registered under the Wrigley name participated in consortiums addressing sustainable agriculture and urban green space, with particular attention to grant-making models emphasizing measurable outcomes. Although the Wrigley family no longer participated in the daily management of the chewing gum business, its legacy was perpetuated architecturally and institutionally. In Chicago, Wrigley Field, purchased by William Wrigley Jr. in 1921, continued to serve as a public reminder of the family's influence. The National Register of Historic Places designation, granted in 1987, supported ongoing preservation efforts and periodic capital campaigns in which family members were named as honorary participants. Wrigley Centennial Plaza, completed in 2021, further anchored the family's imprint in the region. By the end of the 2010s, the Wrigley name remained embedded in a network of charitable endowments, urban landmarks, and conservation programs. Legal filings disclosed the family's diminished role in commercial affairs, but foundation governance minutes and public records demonstrated sustained engagement with civic and philanthropic partners. These developments ensured the continued relevance of the Wrigley legacy, now primarily through institutional, rather than entrepreneurial channels, setting the context for subsequent reconfigurations of the family's public and private contributions. The Wrigley Dynasty's place in American business history is defined by a trajectory of strategic decisions, calculated expansions, and the effective balancing of family stewardship with professional management. Their impact extends far beyond the confectionery market, with significant contributions to sports, urban landmarks, and philanthropy. The company's continued presence in the global marketplace after its acquisition by Mars, Incorporated in 2008, demonstrates the enduring strength of its brand and operational models. Meanwhile, Wrigley Field remains a living testament to the family's role in shaping Chicago's identity and baseball culture. The family's intergenerational story illustrates the complex dynamics that can propel a family name into worldwide recognition, while reminding audiences that behind every prominent brand is a succession of individual choices, challenges, and adaptations. The study of the Wrigley Dynasty offers insight into broader trends in American entrepreneurialism and the evolution of family legacy in the modern business landscape.